In this lesson, we'll look at how cells specialise to perform a particular function. The specification has the following to say. Students should be able to, when provided with appropriate information, multicellular organisms have cells that work as part of a team. Each different cell type is a specialist for a particular role. What makes a cell good at doing one thing may make it bad at doing something else. So different cell types have different features to allow them to specialise and to improve their ability to perform their particular role for the organism. The structure of a cell is related to the role that it plays, its function. As a cell develops after cell division, particular genetic instructions, genes, are activated to change the cell and allow it to develop the features that suit its role. This is called differentiation. When a cell differentiates, becomes specialised, it can change its size, its shape, its metabolic activity, and its overall function. All cells in animals, beginning with the fertilised egg, contain the same DNA. But each type of cell only makes use of the portions of DNA that are relevant to its own function. In animals, most cell types differentiate at an early stage in the life of the organism. Once a cell is differentiated to become a specialist cell, most cell types lose the ability to change into a different cell type. And they usually also lose the ability to divide, to make more copies of themselves. Specialist cells differentiate from undifferentiated stem cells. These are cells which have kept the ability to divide. Now, the situation is different in plants. Stem cells are still responsible for producing specialised cells, but lots of cell types in plants never lose the ability to divide and differentiate throughout the life of the plant. Now, growth in animals takes place throughout the body, but in plants, the growth is restricted to particular areas. These are called meristems. If you remove part of a plant, a replacement part will often grow in its place. That's not usually the case in animals, and it's what allows gardeners to take cuttings and grow them. Mature plants keep on increasing in size. Mature animals don't. Their cell division is just used to repair or replace damaged cells. The growing region of a plant is called the meristem. Plant meristem tissue is at the tip of a growing shoot and at the tip of a growing root, and at the buds, where a new branch will form. There's also a meristem around the circumference of a stem, and at the centre of a root, which allows it to grow wider. Once a new cell is created, most will go on to develop into a specialist cell. The size and shape of a cell, the nature of its cell membrane, and the number of the different types of organelle in the cytoplasm are all the features that vary to make a cell able to perform its particular specialist role. Now, the examiner will expect you to be able to use your knowledge of these things to make a reasonable judgment to match the structure of a cell type to its function. There are also particular examples of specialist cells that you need to understand in more detail. Sperm cells. These are the specialist cells that are used to transfer male genetic information to the female egg cell. The sperm cell is specialised to allow it to swim long distances and to then break into the egg cell. To allow sperm to swim, they are streamlined in shape. The long tail at the back is able to whip back and forth to propel the cell along. To provide energy, the energy needed for swimming, the sperm has a lot of mitochondria packed into the base of the tail at the front of the cell. And there's a special vacuole called the acrosome containing the enzymes used to break into the egg cell, and that's at the front of the sperm, or the head. To make sure the cell is as streamlined as possible, the cytoplasm is just big enough to contain the nucleus and the acrosome and little else. Nerve cells. Now, nerve cells are called neurons, and their role is to provide rapid communication between parts of the body. This type of cell is specialised at transmitting an electrical impulse along its length. To allow the cell to reach different parts of the body, they can be very long. In humans, there are individual cells reaching from the tip of your toe to the base of your spine. To allow neurons to communicate with lots of other cells, they have highly branched endings. Along the length of some neurons, there is a fatty myelin sheath formed by another cell wrapping around the neuron. The myelin sheath insulates the electrical impulse travelling along the length of the neuron. But not all neurons have a myelin sheath. Those that do are able to transmit impulses particularly quickly. Gaps exist between each section of myelin sheath, and these help to boost the impulse travelling to the next section. Electrical impulses travel along the neuron, but they can't pass across the tiny gap between neurons. The signal passes across the gap when chemicals called neurotransmitters are released from one side and diffuse across to the other side of the gap and stimulate an impulse to start at the next neuron. The tiny gap between the neurons is called a synapse. At the synapse, the cell membrane of neurons are specialised to have receptor proteins that can respond to neurotransmitters released by the previous neuron. Once the receptor proteins in the cell membrane have been stimulated, a new electrical impulse starts and the signal carries along the neuron. The cytoplasm of the neuron has lots of small storage vacuoles for neurotransmitters waiting to be used, and an increased amount of the organelles used to produce them. The mechanism for making the neuron ready to transmit an impulse along its length relies upon using energy to move charged particles out of the cell. The energy needed for this process is provided by mitochondria, so neurons also contain a large number of mitochondria in their cytoplasm. Muscle cells. The function of a muscle cell is to contract and change shape to pull on neighbouring cells. To achieve this, muscle cells have collections of contractile proteins in their cytoplasm that can collectively change their length by pulling past each other. The mechanism for these protein filaments pulling past each other requires energy. So muscle cells have large numbers of mitochondria to provide the energy needed for contraction. To be effective at contracting, a muscle cell at rest will be long and thin, because this allows it to become short and fat when contracted. An individual muscle cell working alone will have little power, but muscle cells attached to other muscle cells early in their development, forming very long muscle fibres. Now, there are three main types of muscle cell in humans. The appearance and characteristics of these three types are linked to the different arrangements of their contractile protein filaments. Skeletal muscle cells are also sometimes called striated muscle, and they have a striped appearance. These cells are under our conscious control and are used mainly for moving limbs. They are particularly powerful at contracting, but they're also prone to becoming tired and unable to contract until they've rested. Smooth muscle cells don't have a striped appearance, and they're not under our conscious control. These cells are used all over the body where movement is required, but conscious control is not used. So smooth muscle cells surround our blood vessels to control their diameter. They surround our gut and contract to move food along. Now, smooth muscle cells can't contract as powerfully as skeletal muscle fibers, but by limiting how much they contract, they're more able to sustain their ability to contract when needed. Heart muscle cells have features similar to both of these cell types. They have a striped appearance and the ability to contract very forcefully, but they're not under our conscious control, which removes our ability to instruct them to overwork and cease being able to contract. After all, a tired heart muscle couldn't pump the blood which is needed to recover from tiredness. Aside from only being controlled by our subconscious, heart muscle cells have more mitochondria than other muscle types. They have a better blood supply, and they use slightly different enzymes to reduce the chances of lactic acid buildup. Now to plants. Root hair cells. Now these are found on the surface layer at the ends of the branches of a root. They are not hairs, but they have a hair-like appearance because of the fine filaments of cytoplasm sticking out from them in the shape of a hair. The function of a root hair cell is to absorb water and minerals from the soil. The hair-like shape gives the cells a very large surface area compared to the size of its interior. As well as their large surface area to volume ratio, the cells lack a waxy cuticle, and they have a thin cell wall to reduce the diffusion distance for water being absorbed by osmosis. Root hair cells have a large permanent vacuole to allow as much water as possible to be absorbed, and they are close to xylem cells, so the water can move into these for transport around the plant. Now, mineral ions are not absorbed passively like water. Root hair cells use active transport to allow them to absorb mineral ions, even when they have more than the surrounding soil. As active transport uses energy, the root hair cells have a lot of mitochondria to provide the energy that's needed. The cell membrane of the root hair cells will also have a large number of the particular proteins used for active transport for particular ions. Since root hair cells normally lack the light needed for photosynthesis, they don't waste the energy needed to manufacture chloroplasts within the cytoplasm. Xylem. Xylem is part of the vascular tissue of a plant, like the blood vessels in humans. There are a few different types of xylem cell. Collectively, their function is to provide support and transport. Now, the main characteristic of xylem is that its cell walls become impregnated with a tar-like substance called lignin. Lignin stiffens the cell wall and prevents materials such as water from flowing through the cell membrane into or out of the cytoplasm. Now, this eventually leads to the death of the cell. But what remains is a very useful shell. The first xylem cells to be produced as the regions of the plant grow have lignin which is laid down in spirals and rings. This allows the growing cell to lengthen between the lignin. Mature xylem cells line up end to end in plants, and they have a complete covering of lignin. Now, depending on the type of plant involved, there are two main types of mature xylem cell: vessels and tracheids. Tracheids have pits within the lignin that allows water to flow from cell to cell. But in the most highly evolved plants, there's also Xylem Vessels. In Xylem Vessels, the end wall of the cell is digested, allowing a series of elongated cells to form a rigid pipe-like structure through which water can flow much more rapidly. The mechanism for the transport of water up through the plant relies upon the evaporation from the leaf. The tubes through which the water travels are not actively involved in the process. Phloem. Phloem is involved in the transport of sugars within the plant. The mechanism for the movement of sugar solution uses the active involvement of the cells which the sugar moves through. Now, since this is an active involvement, these cells can't be killed with lignified cell walls. Phloem tissue has two types of cell working closely together: sieve tubes and companion cells. Sieve tubes are elongated cells joined end to end. The end walls of the sieve tubes are perforated with pores, and this forms a long hollow pipe that allows sugar solution to pass through. To maximise the space in the tube formed by phloem cells, mature sieve tubes have no nucleus, and their cytoplasm is pushed to the sides of the cell. Sieve tubes are kept alive and supported in their function by the activities of their companion cells. Now, aside from lacking a permanent vacuole, the companion cells have all the usual organelles present in a plant cell. To reduce the diffusion distance between the companion cell and the sieve tube, the companion cells have an unusually thin cell wall. Since the process of moving sugar through the plant requires the active involvement of the phloem cells, the companion cells are very metabolically active, and so they contain a lot of mitochondria to provide the energy needed for this metabolism. Don't forget to download the resources for this video from the link in the description, especially the notes template. LearnFix has a lot more to offer than just the videos and the exam questions. The most popular aspect is the set of 12 online learning games we have for each topic. These help you practice your recall of the details. Now, when it comes to revision, LearnFix is there to help. After each section of the syllabus, there's a diagnostic quiz to help focus your revision efforts. You can then use a progress report to look back at the details for that particular topic, what went well and what needs more work. We're adding new features every month, so visit us at learnfix.com to find out more.